What I am going to deal with this afternoon are the results in completely surprising areas of our rejection of the 1888 message. Usually we think righteousness by faith when we hear 1888. We're not even going to talk about righteousness by faith this afternoon. We're going to talk about the results of rejecting that message, what it has cost us in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and what we probably have to do to correct the losses. All right? So that will be our focus for this afternoon. The results, what might have been, is the title for it. I'm going to begin by reading two parts of two letters or manuscripts that Ellen White wrote shortly after 1888, just to give you the flavor of how she felt about what had transpired at that conference. Here's the way she said it. The Lord was working, and I must be faithful to speak the words given me, although I was passing through the most grievous trial of my life. For from this hour, that confidence which I had hitherto had that God was leading and controlling the minds and hearts of my brethren was not as heretofore. I had felt that when a call came to me, "We want you at our meeting, Sister White, your influence is needed," I should not consult my choice or my feelings, but would arise by faith and try to act my part and leave the Lord to do the work that was essential to be done. Now a greater burden falls upon me. From this time I must look alone to God, for I dare not rely upon the wisdom of my brethren. I see they do not always take God for their counselor, but look in a large degree to the men they have set before them in the place of God. That's a pretty strong statement for Ellen White to make. As you know, she generally followed whatever counsel the brethren gave her as to what should be done, and now she says, I can't do that anymore. I tried at the meeting in Battle Creek, this is a year later, to make my position plain, but not a word or response came from the men who should have stood with me. I stated that I stood nearly alone at Minneapolis. Not one ventured to say, I am with you, Sister White, I will stand by you. And that may be the single greatest result of what happened in 1888. Ellen White's credibility was severely damaged because she stood with Jones and Wagoner, and the brethren felt that that was not proper. Ellen White is getting old. She may be senile. We don't know if we can trust Ellen White anymore. And that is probably the most significant aspect of what happened. She relates this. I was invited to speak the next Sabbath in the tabernacle. That is the tabernacle of Battle Creek, which was the denominational headquarters. But afterwards, because the impressions were so strong that I had changed, I think the brother felt a little sorry he had asked me. 2 elders visited me on Sabbath morning, and I was asked by one what I was going to speak upon. I said, Brethren, you leave that matter with the Lord and Sister White, for neither the Lord nor Sister White will need to be dictated to by the brethren as to what subject she will bring before them. Interesting little conversation there. As you know, the elders were there to make sure that Ellen White would not be bringing a subject they didn't like, and they wanted to know what she was going to talk about, and that was her response. So, that is one little aspect of what happened during this time. If you want the reference for that, I can give it to you rather easily if you want to look it up yourself. It is manuscript. It is in the 1888 materials, pages 352 to 381. The Ellen White 1888 materials, 352 to 381. And then another one other reaction that Ellen White had on this subject. She said, the leaders of the people today, and now she is talking about Seventh-day Adventist leaders, pursue the same course of action that the Jews pursued. Now think about that for a minute. What course of action did the Jews pursue when Christ was there trying to help them find their way? They turned against Christ in every way. They tried to undermine his teachings. They tried to remove him physically from his ministry. And now she says, the leaders of the people today pursue the same course of action that the Jews pursued. They criticize and ply question after question and refuse to admit evidence, treating the light sent them in the very same way that the Jews treated the light Christ brought them. That's a strong parallel that she's making, an almost devastating parallel, that we're treating truth in the same way that the Jews treated Christ. The message and the messengers have not been received but despised. In rejecting the message given at Minneapolis, men committed sin. They have committed far greater sin by retaining for years the same hatred against God's messengers, by rejecting the truth that the Holy Spirit has been urging home. By making light of the message given, they are making light of the Word of God. These rejectors of light cease to recognize light. In this time, light from the throne of God has been long resisted as an objectionable thing. It has been regarded as darkness and spoken of as fanaticism, as something dangerous to be shunned. And then this remarkable sentence: thus men have become guideposts pointing in the wrong direction. They have followed the example set by the Jewish people. Guideposts pointing in the wrong direction. I'm afraid that's what we have today in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, is guideposts pointing in the wrong direction. You will hear it from all kinds of sources, from all kinds of individuals, those you have trusted, those you have respected. And again, not all, praise the Lord. There are still valiant warriors for truth in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but they fight an uphill battle these days. It is not an easy thing to preach truth in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so what Ellen White is talking about here is something on her heart that is deeply devastating to her as to what is happening in Adventism. All right, I wanted to share those with you because I wanted you to feel the way Ellen White is responding to what had happened in her time. Now, I came across a very interesting advertisement way back in 1985, and I've kept it in my files all these years. This was the World General Conference session in Louisiana in the New Orleans Superdome. And before the General Conference session, there is always a ministers' council in which the ministers are called together a week before the General Conference to come together in a conference. And here was the advertisement for that particular year. In 1888, the direction of the Adventist Church took an upward turn at the Minneapolis ministerial precession. The slide toward legalism came face to face with the uplifted Christ, and the church has not been the same since. The 1985 World Ministers' Council follows in the tradition of 1888. That is an interesting advertisement. I don't know that I want to follow in the tradition of 1888, my friends, in terms of what the church did. And yet we're being told that that was an upward turn, what happened in 1888. Well, you have to decide, like I said this morning, you have to decide whether the prophet's analysis of 1888 is right or whether our leader's analysis of 1888 is correct, because they are diametrically opposed. In fact, one of the leaders of the Adventist Church, who was the president of the Adventist Church for the longest period in Adventist history, A.G. Daniels, during the 1900 transition period, here is what he wrote when he wrote a book in 1926 called Christ Our Righteousness, about 1888. He said, "It is difficult to conceive how there could be any misunderstanding or uncertainty regarding the heavenly endorsement of this message. It clearly stated that the Lord sent the message, and that he led the minds of the men who were so deeply engrossed by it and who proclaimed it with such earnestness. It should be borne in mind that the course taken by the messengers in subsequent years," you know they both fell away, "has nothing to do with the positive statement oft repeated that they were led by the Lord to declare this fundamental truth of the gospel to his people at that particular time." In other words, the end result of the messengers has nothing to do with the truth of their message. This is what he's saying. And then he said, "This message is of greater significance to the church at the present time," that's 1926, "than it could have been in 1888. The nearer we approach the great day of God, the more imperative will be the need of the soul-cleansing work which that message was sent to do. Surely we have every reason for a new, more wholehearted study and proclamation of that message. It must be expected that the message of righteousness by faith, which came so definitely to the church in 1888, will be accorded a dominant place in the closing period of the great movement with which we are connected. So, on the basis of the authority of a general conference president, I will say to you, let's get busy and study those messages. Let's see what those messages have to say about getting ready for translation. If we have any hope of being the generation that will be translated, we need to be serious about knowing how to do it. And those were the messages that told this Seventh-day Adventist church how to get ready for translation. Why have we lingered so long? Probably because we have ignored, buried, and despised those messages. We have even written books saying that we should not study those messages because they will lead us into apostasy. You can buy that book on our ABC bookshelves. Another one has just come out, and I haven't even read that one, and I'm sure it'll say virtually the same thing. Don't study the message. It is fanaticism. It is dangerous. Men have become guideposts pointing in the wrong direction. The only message which can prepare us for the latter rain of the seal of God, we are being warned not to study. Brothers and sisters, study the message for yourself. Don't just listen to your pastor tell it to you. Study it for yourself. Know what it says. All right. Now we get into the two, and I'm only going to deal with two specific areas that have been results of the rejection of the 1888 message, which we probably haven't even noticed because we've grown up in those results all our lives, and we've never known anything different. So I'm going to start with a little story. On April 14, 1902, a young man with $500 in cash opened a dry goods store in Kemmerer, Wyoming. Kemmerer was a mining town of only 1,000 people on the old Lewis and Clark Trail, the covered wagon trail. To save money, the young man and his wife lived in the attic over the little store. They used clothing crates for furniture. There were various sizes for tables and chairs. The young wife would wrap the baby in a blanket and lay him under the counter while she helped Jim tend the store. It was a frugal and solid way to start a business. As the decades unrolled, Jim's enterprise expanded to over 1,000 stores from coast to coast. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to who Jim really is? No guesses? No, not you. No one want to hazard a guess? Oh. No, not Sears and Roebuck, but pretty close to that. Jim is J.C. Penney. That's right. That's how J.C. Penney began his work in 1902 in a mining town of 1,000 people. Now, the interesting thing about J.C. Penney was he was a religious man as well, and he gave large contributions to the Lord during his lifetime. Now, here's the rest of the story. When the Great Depression hit our country, it came to a time of real financial vulnerability for J.C. Penney. His stores continued to do well during that period, but he had been making outside investments in other interests during this period, and they were not doing so well. In fact, he was in serious trouble to finance these interests. He had borrowed extensively to start these other interests that he was involved in. And in addition, as I said, he was a major philanthropist, gave large amounts of money to hospitals and other individuals. And all of a sudden, in the Depression, the bank said, we need our money back now, not 5 years from now when you were intending to pay it back. And Penney had a cash flow problem. He was finding it difficult to pay back his loans, and it was taking a toll on his health as well. He was not immune to this stress, this unending worry about how he was going to pay his loans back to the bank. Here's the way he said it. I was so harassed with worries that I couldn't sleep and developed an extremely painful ailment. That ailment was shingles. If any of you have had any experience with that, that's not a fun thing to deal with. It is a painful skin rash that often accompanies an emotionally exhausted person. Well, his doctor tried everything that he could, all kinds of remedies. He finally recommended a health resort in south central Michigan. And so Penny took his advice, and his train chugged out of Chicago, and 3 hours later, Battle Creek, next stop. Where did his doctor advise him to go for health and to cure? Was to our Battle Creek Sanitarium run by Dr. Kellogg. And so that's where he was headed, and here is his description as to what happened when he was admitted to the sanitarium. I got weaker, he said, day by day. I was broken nervously and physically, filled with despair, unable to see even a ray of hope. I had nothing to live for. I felt that I hadn't a friend left in the world, that even my family had turned against me. Remember now, this is this prosperous man who was in deep financial trouble during the Depression. And then is when his doctor told him to go off to Battle Creek, to give it a try there. So he said, getting out of bed, I wrote farewell letters to my wife and to my son, saying that I did not expect to live to see the dawn. That was his first night at Battle Creek. When I awoke in the morning, I was surprised to find that I was still alive. Going downstairs, I heard singing in a little chapel where devotional exercises were held each morning. I can still remember the hymn they were singing, God Will Take Care of You. Going into the chapel, I listened with a weary heart to the singing, the reading of the scripture lesson, and the prayer. Suddenly, something happened. I can't explain it. I can only call it a miracle. I felt as if I had been instantly lifted out of the darkness of a dungeon into warm, brilliant sunlight. I felt as if I had been transported from hell to paradise. I felt the power of God as I had never felt it before. I knew that God, with His love, was there to help me. From that day to this, my life has been free from worry. I am now 71 years old, and the most dramatic and glorious 20 minutes of my life were those I spent in that chapel that morning. God will take care of you. That was before he had any treatments. He hadn't even gone into the doctor's office to see what he should do to take care of his shingles problem. His problem was a mental problem. It was a depression problem. It was a worry and anxiety problem. And what he needed was the presence of the Holy Spirit. And how did he get that? In this special place where people had faith in God and were singing a song that touched his heart. And he said, a miracle happened in my mind. And that's what he needed. And I'm sure that the physical problems, were taken care of shortly after that as well. So, medical missionary work, my friends. Medical missionary work. Ellen White called it the right arm of the message. She encouraged people to understand and practice the principles of this work. I'm going to share a little follow-up to what happened in Battle Creek. The sanitarium, Battle Creek Sanitarium, became world-renowned. In other words, it was not just known here in the United States, but there were a number of individuals from Europe that came also to this well-respected sanitarium in Battle Creek for what was happening and what could be done regarding health. Tragedy of tragedies, it was from his own brethren in the church that Kellogg found the greatest resistance. Real acceptance by the world out there, resistance from the church. It pained Kellogg that the conference brethren demanded chicken and meat when they visited the sanitarium, while his patients from the world accepted vegetarian fare with eagerness. Can you imagine his thinking along these lines? His grief over this reality caused his trust and respect for them to wane. And then, of course, the brethren thought that Kellogg was an extremist because he was not doing it like they wanted him to do it. So you can see the breach that was beginning to develop between the leading brethren, the leaders of the church, the evangelists, the ministers, and the health workers. Here is the way Ellen White describes this. It will be seen sometime that our brethren and sisters have not been inspired by the Spirit of Christ in their manner of dealing with Dr. Kellogg. Your attitude toward him will not bear the approval of God. You can pursue a course that will so weaken his confidence in his brethren that they cannot help him when and where he needs to be helped. And a time would come when Dr. Kellogg was in real need of help regarding his theology, his understanding of who God was, his understanding of how righteousness was operating. That was in the period of the early 1900s. And he desperately needed some help from those that he trusted, and now he didn't trust them, and they didn't trust him. That's what Ellen White is referring here to. If the doctor fails in doing his duty and being an overcomer at last, and he did, he failed, and he was not an overcomer at last, those brethren who have failed in their want of wisdom and discernment to help the man when and where he needed their help will be in a large measure responsible. She said the same thing about their treatment of Jones and Waggoner, by the way, that there would be that responsibility. And she said, our ministers are very slow to become health reformers. This has caused Dr. Kellogg to lose confidence in them. Reference for that, it's a little bit hard to find. Manuscript 175, 1888, found in the Battle Creek Letters, pages 12 to 14. So what happened? Medical work and ministerial work went in opposite directions. Was that Ellen White's vision? The vision of Ellen White was that they cooperate hand in hand. You know what her vision was for medical missionary work? That in every reasonable-sized town, and this is a reasonable-sized town, there should be a clinic with a doctor and a minister working together on the same salary for the salvation of souls. That was her vision for medical missionary work. Throughout America, in every reasonable-sized town, a doctor and a minister working together in medical missionary work. Not even close to that. We haven't even touched that with our fingertips. Instead, we've had large healing centers called hospitals. Sanitarium is out of date. Now we put people in 3 days and they're gone. They barely know what Seventh-day Adventism is. And then we have some clinics, some programs that we put on here and there that touch a few, but not medical missionary work. We have never seen medical missionary work in the Seventh-day Adventist Church outside of a few self-supporting institutions. That's the reality. It was never the medical work was never made a department of the church. We have departments like education department, we have temperance department, we have youth departments, but medical work was never made a department of the church, thus not under church supervision, thus it grew apart from the church. And medical work has gone that way, ministerial work has gone that way, and we have never seen true evangelism done through medical missionary work in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, except, as I say, for a few self-supporting institutions. And it's tough for those institutions. They get no funding, they get no help, and they struggle. I want to share one other thing. Percy McGann was one of those who was involved in educational reform at Madison Institute, and he later became the president of Loma Linda it wasn't called Loma Linda University then, it was called the College of Medical Evangelists, but that's what he was president of. And in 1927, Percy McGann wrote this letter to a friend of his. I was very much pained to see in a recent number of the Review a back page advertising for doctors to go into the work, meaning doctors to go into various types of Adventist work, not going into their own practice, but going into Adventist work of various kinds. Very few, he said. It does seem too bad that after all that providence, toil, and treasure have done to build up this school, such a small percentage of its output seems to be available for the one thing above all others for which it has been founded. Personally, I feel that the situation is heartbreaking. I have given 11 of the best years of my life to endeavoring to put this school on a solid foundation, but I am now seriously raising the question in my own mind as to whether I cannot do more if I went out into some humble place in the work than I can do by staying here when we see so little fruit of our labors. That had to be discouraging for a health reformer and an education reformer. A decade later, he was still president of College of Medical Evangelists, and he wrote another letter. I do not know what lies ahead of the school. I am praying. Sometimes I think almost night and day, and spending much time on my knees in earnest supplication. It may be that this school will have to go down, and upon its ashes God will uprear one of a sort more in harmony with His will. As I see things here, they are in a great, great peril. Pride, professionalism, and a haughty spirit have laid firm hold on some. On the other hand, a large number of the alumni are sound, and all I can do is to contend for the faith which was once delivered unto the saints. God's standards for His institutions must be maintained. Can you feel a bit of pain right there in that letter? You know, that statement, it may be that this school will have to go down, and upon its ashes God will uprear one of a sort more in harmony with His will. This is the president of that institution. This is the one who wanted that institution to succeed more than any other individual. He left Madison specifically to build up that institution in Southern California. Well, and again, what I'm simply saying is one of the results of the rejection of the 1888 message was the split between the medical and the ministerial work in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have grown up in a church which has no knowledge of how to do medical missionary work. And we haven't really known any other way because we've grown up all the way in that system. So what can we do about that? Support, help, encourage these self-supporting institutions who are trying to do it God's way. They're having a great struggle. It's not easy. They're not perfect. You know, they have their mistakes and their struggles just like everyone, but they're trying. They're trying hard to do it God's way, and it'll get much support in many ways. All right. Now the area that I am more familiar with, because this is an area in which I have given a good share of my life to, and that is the work of education. Give you a little background of how this all transpired. As you probably know, after 1888, for about 3 years, Jones, Wagoner, and Ellen White traveled around the churches, particularly in the Michigan area and surrounding areas. I'm sure she got down into Indiana as well, holding revival meetings. And there was a real response to these among the people. The 1888 message of righteousness by faith was striking a responsive chord among the lay people of the Seventh-day Adventist Church during those 3 years. At about 1891, the leaders of the church decided that this was not good, that these three working together were causing more trouble than good. So their solution? Separate them. Send Ellen White off to Australia. There was good to be done out in Australia. Ellen White could be sent over there. Send Wagoner off to England. There was good to be done in England. Send Wagoner off there. Jones, he could make his own way as best he could in the United States. And so the brethren separated the messengers, and Ellen White was sent off to Australia. Ellen White later said that she had received no direct instruction from the Lord to go to Australia, but the brethren had decided that that's where they wanted to send her, and she acquiesced to their suggestion, and she went off to Australia. But she had one ulterior motive in going over there. Australia is a long way from Battle Creek, and Battle Creek would have a hard time keeping their fingers in the pie over in Australia. There were there was no fax communication. Telegraph, was infancy, and, things you couldn't communicate nearly as well. So Ellen White could pretty well do her own thing over in Australia without the brethren supervising her work. So she decided, if there is one thing I can do in Australia, besides the writing of her books, she made that a major effort. Desire of Ages came out of that Australia experience. Praise the Lord for that. But outside of that, she decided that she would be able to start a school the way the Lord wanted education to be done. She had tried it in Battle Creek. It hadn't worked. There was no way that education was working properly in Battle Creek, in the middle of the city. And so she said, we'll do it right. We will start a school in Australia that will be the model for all Adventist education. And you know the name of that school. It is Avondale College. And that was done by the initiative of Ellen White's leadings and the brethren around her that began that particular endeavor. It was a very interesting endeavor. They plowed up the sports fields and planted gardens in place of the tennis courts. They did all kinds of interesting things over there. And so this was a very unique experiment in education. It developed over the course of the years, and one person in particular was kind of watching this development. He was the president of Walla Walla College. His name was E.A. Sutherland. And he was thinking to himself, maybe she's got something over there that we need over here. And he began to initiate some of the reforms at Walla Walla that Ellen White had been starting in Australia. The brethren in Battle Creek were also kind of struggling. The school was not going well. It wasn't the way it should be, and they knew it. It had even closed down completely for 1 year. And so they saw what Sutherland was doing over in Walla Walla in Washington, and they said, we need you to do that over here at the headquarters. We need you to bring those reforms into Battle Creek. And Sutherland agreed that this again could be the place in which education could be disseminated throughout the Adventist world from the headquarters. But he said, you're going to have to do one thing if there's any chance of making it work in Battle Creek, and that is move out of Battle Creek. It can't work in the middle of the city. It is totally hopeless. We've got to have land. We've got to have agriculture. We've got to have room for expansion. We've got to have a place where teachers and students can work together to produce various things in industry. We've got to have a place where students can learn a trade. And so the brethren agreed that they would move from Battle Creek. Where did they move to? I'll challenge your Adventist history. Where did the brethren from Battle Creek move to start the new school in Michigan? Berrien Springs, Michigan, which is now Andrews University. Then it was called Emmanuel Missionary College. All right. They moved down. They had a big train, hauled everything down to Berrien Springs, a little outpost in the middle of nowhere. If you've been there, there's nothing around there except trees and rivers and stuff like that. And so they moved it out there to that outpost, built the first buildings, and began the educational work. And so Sutherland initiated the various reforms. And I'll just give you a few of the reforms so you'll get a picture of it. Like I mentioned, the work-study program in which teachers worked with the students. Degrees were abandoned. You didn't get a degree when you graduated. You got a certificate for whatever program you had decided to get into. Your schedule of classes was not determined by a set program in which everybody took English 101. Your classes were determined by what you wanted to achieve when you left the institution. If you wanted to go into educational work, if you wanted to go into medical work, depending on what your background had been, a tailor-made schedule of classes was made for you that would meet your needs, not duplicating what you had done before and moving you ahead as fast as you could in your chosen program. And as I say, at the end of that program, you received a certificate that you had completed the program, because the objective was not to grant a degree of completion, but to prepare you for service in various ways. And so this was part of the program as well. Grading was greatly de-emphasized. What was emphasized was progress and how well you were doing and how much you were learning and how much you needed to know. And you would go slow or fast depending on your progress. Those were a few of the reforms, and there were more. Quite a few health-related reforms as well. Well, E.A. Sutherland and he brought in McGann at this time, lasted for 2 whole years at Emmanuel Missionary College. And the constituents, the ones who were involved in supporting the school and sending their children there, became so unhappy with the program that they refused to send their children any longer if Sutherland would remain there. And Sutherland resigned. That was the future. Well, I shouldn't say the future. That was the present reality of Adventist educational reform at the center of Adventist work. The way the historian of Andrews University phrased it was this: in the 50 ensuing years, the college plodded on toward prestige and status with startling reforms shunned. Prestige, yeah, it's got it today. Status, you bet it has it today. You read about it in U.S. News and World Report. You read about it in Time magazine. It's got its status. But startling reforms shunned. And so he decided he would have to try something else. He was not ready to give up just yet. So he and McGann, talking to Ellen White, decided they would head down the river. And they headed down toward Tennessee. As they were moving down the river, they stopped at various places. And in one particular place, Ellen White said, "This is the place I saw in vision. This is where we are going to have our training institute." Sutherland and McGann took a look at it. It was hard, rocky ground. How could you support anything? There were a few old pig pens and broken down chicken coops on the place. And Sutherland, we're told, sat down on a rock and cried. The worst possible place he could envision for starting a school. But Sutherland had implicit and total faith in the prophetic inspiration and authority of God's messenger. And he says, if God says to build it here, we build it here. No questions asked. Got over his little crying spell. And set up Madison Institute, just north of Nashville. Madison Institute started out very slow, as you can imagine, but it moved ahead by leaps and bounds as it became established. And Madison Institute, during its heyday, and we're talking about during the 20s, 30s period, became almost as famous as Battle Creek Sanitarium under Kellogg. In fact, people from overseas would come across and study what was going on at Madison. Because you see, overseas, there's not a lot of money to fund various things in education. And they want their students to be able to learn a trade. And that's what we were doing down at Madison. Very little money and practical education. And they were asking us how to do the work overseas in various countries that was like what they were watching. Madison Institute progressed very, very effectively. Now, I want to share a few things that Ellen White said about Madison during this period, because remember now, Madison was not an Adventist educational institution. It was a self-supporting institution. It was not like Walla Walla and PUC and Emmanuel Missionary College and Southern College. Those are all denominationally funded and supported colleges. Madison was entirely self-supporting. It received no financial help from the church, nor emotional help or psychological help. It was set out there as, okay, if you want to do it, we'll let you do it, but we're not going to do anything to help you. That's the way it was looked at. Here's a few phrasings of Ellen White regarding this. To the leading brethren in 1907, you have a work to do to encourage the schoolwork in Madison, Tennessee. The workers who have been striving to carry out the mind and will of God in Madison have not received the encouragement they should have. She said the work at Madison would be a spectacle to the world, to angels, and to men, and it would be an object lesson to the southern field. Well, perhaps there's more, but that's enough here. Here's a few more of a different category. In the matter of the Madison School, there has been a standing off from them because they were not under the ownership and control of some conference. It is not the Lord's plan that means should be withheld from Madison because they are not bound to the conference. Means monies, offerings. And it is not even restricted to just general offerings. Sometimes means actually refers to tithe. It is not the Lord's plan that means should be withheld from Madison because they are not bound to the conference. The attitude which some of our brethren have assumed toward this enterprise shows that it is not wise for every working agency to be under the dictation of conference officers. There are some enterprises under certain conditions that will produce better results if standing alone. When my advice was asked in reference to the Madison School, I said, "Remain as you are. There is danger of binding every working agency under the dictation of the conference. The Lord did not design that this should be." When many of the leading brethren in our conferences ignored them because they did not place the school under conference dictation, I was shown that they would not be helped by making themselves amenable to the conference. They had better remain as led by God, amenable to Him to work out His plans. And she had a lot more to say on this subject. I am bidden to bear my testimony against unnecessary restrictions being laid on those who desire to act a part in the work of the Lord. My brethren, stand out of the way of your fellow beings. Those were a few of the counsels. A couple more. The work that the laborers have accomplished at Madison has done more to give a correct knowledge of what an all-round education means than any other school that has been established by Seventh-day Adventists in America. She wrote that when our colleges were all in existence, virtually. All of them. If many more in other schools were receiving a similar training, we as a people would become a spectacle to the world, to angels, and to men. The message would quickly be carried to every country, and souls now in darkness would be brought to the light. Those were a few, just a few, of the Ellen White comments regarding Madison Institute. And Ellen White was a member of the board at Madison, the only board of school that she ever was a member of during her entire life. All right, what was the issue? Ellen White had endeavored to start a school at Avondale that was to be the model for all Adventist education. That vision had been transferred over to Sutherland, who had been called to the headquarters to begin that work of educational reform in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He had been able to do it for 2 years in one of our regular colleges, and that was it. And so he began, under Ellen White's guidance, a new institute in Madison, very similar to Avondale because it was outside of the control of the leaders of the church. And so they began that institute down there. What was its purpose? Exactly the same as Avondale, to be the model school of how education should be done throughout the Seventh-day Adventist system. What happened to the school? Well, as I say, for a number of years it was very healthy. It progressed well, but not within the Seventh-day Adventist system. Not one thing that Madison did was incorporated into our regular colleges. Our colleges went an entirely different way, accreditation and all the rest. And so Madison continued. But by the time of the 1940s and the 1950s, things were not going so well for Madison because now the leaders had passed on. They were no longer there. Others had come to take their place. And, when you don't get a degree, you can't go on to professional school, you can't go to law, and you can't go to medicine. So now our students were going to our regular colleges and kind of bypassing this Madison school down in Tennessee. And so it was really struggling for students during those years. And finally, the vision completely died, and Madison Institute died. It was gone and never has been revived within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The great model for Adventist education, for all education, completely died. And we went a different way in the Adventist church. Every single one of us has grown up if you've gone to our Adventist schools, has grown up in an Adventist system of education which is totally outside of the vision that Ellen White had for education. A completely different kind of education. Yet we still claim that this education is under the special blessing of God, and it is the way we should educate our children. I want to hasten to us to say that this is primarily the issue of college education and secondarily of academy education. At our elementary levels, we are still, in some places, doing it the way God intended it to do. And most of those are in rural areas with 1 or 2 teacher schools. The more teachers we get and the larger the school children get, the more close we are to the public school system. And it is completely different from the rural schools with 1 or 2 teachers. And as you move ahead into the academy level, it's virtually the same on many levels as the public school system and at the college level. I'll just give you a couple of examples of things that I have come across. Here is one interesting thing. This is Fundamentals on Christian Education by Ellen White, page 229. I have not been able to find one instance where Christ educated his disciples to engage in amusements of football or pugilistic games, to obtain physical exercise, or in theatrical performances. Yet Christ was our pattern in all things. Does that sound like what we're doing today in our regular schools? Well, we have got major athletic activities, not just in the local school like it was when I was growing up. We had our best football and baseball and basketball within the local school. Now we've got our varsity teams that go out and play with this school and that school and the other school, and we have athletic scholarships. And we call our physical education teachers coaches. That is what they are hired for, to prepare a varsity team to go out and play another institution and win their conference championship. I have not found one instance where he educated his disciples to engage in those amusements or in theatrical performances. In almost every school, there's a drama department now. In almost every school, there's a drama department. That is just one little thing that I came across. Here is a letter that someone wrote to the Adventist Review, a mother. She said, "Drop by the public school playground at recess time and listen to the children play. Then do the same at the Adventist school. I know you will be rudely awakened to the obvious truth that what our church schools claim to be and what they really are 2 different things. It is time we stopped kidding ourselves that we are so much better than other churches and other schools. Yes, we have the truth. We're just not living it. Christian education begins at home." And here, my friends, is the single biggest problem of Adventist education. It's not really the teachers. We still have some pretty good teachers. It's not really the curriculum. We have a fairly decent curriculum in our schools. It is what the kids are talking about at recess time on our elementary and academy levels. It is what the conversation is about. My son knows that well. He went to our schools for 3 years, and the conversation was the latest movie and the latest rock stars and what was going on. And if you didn't know who they were, you were not in. And that's what this mother is talking about. The public school playground and the Adventist playground are virtually indistinguishable in what they are talking about and what they are dealing with. The biggest problem of Adventist education today is peer pressure. Peer pressure. And that is devastating our young people right now. All right, here is another one from Ellen White, Testimonies to Ministers 265 and 266. Through association with the world, our institutions will become unsubstantial, unreliable, because these worldly elements introduced and placed in positions of trust are looked up to as teachers to be respected in their educating, directing, and official position, and they are sure to be worked upon by the spirit and power of darkness, so that the demarcation becomes not distinguished between him that serveth God and him that serveth him not. That's the issue. The demarcation becomes not distinguished between him that serveth God and him that serveth him not. When I went to Andrews University, and I'll frankly say right here up front, I have gone to Adventist education all my educational experience, and I've been to Andrews University on 2 different occasions. One of the presidents of Andrews University when I was there was Dr. Richard Hamill, and he wrote this little thing, which I thought was just amazing. He said, "There are critics of our school system who claim that the Adventist school system is far off course and that we are doing many things wrong. I do not believe them." And then he said this, "Some things may be a little different even than specific instructions given by Ellen White." All right? A little different. And then he said, why? Why is that? Today, we cannot get students to live in harmony with those specific instructions. It is an absolute impossibility to operate on that plan. In other words, if we lived up to these instructions, the students wouldn't come. I remember that so vividly at Pacific Union College when I was a teacher there. We were at a very, shall we say, watershed time period in that institution back in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And a number of us were saying, let's bring PUC back to its years of glory, because it was one of the outstanding educational institutions for many, many years, especially in religious instruction. And we were urging, some of us, that we move back to the standards, the high standards that we had held, and the very good instruction that we had had. The president of the college said, if we did that, we would lose the support of our constituents. They wouldn't send their kids here. They'd send them to La Sierra or to Walla Walla, and PUC would go down the drain. Can't do it. And that's what Dr. Hamill was saying about Andrews. And then he said there are other particulars that have had to be adapted as the years have gone by. So what Ellen White said, we can't quite do it that way. But then this is the amazing part of his little statement. He said, I searched the guidelines of the founder of this institution very carefully. We must continue to study these guidelines and to follow their instruction. Well, he just said that we can't follow the specific instructions given by Ellen White. How do you square that? I don't know. Another just an interesting sidelight. Dwight Nelson is the pastor of the Pioneer Memorial Church at Andrews University. And when they were dedicating J.N. Andrews' statue, they were put up a statue of J.M. Andrews, and they were dedicating the statue. He had a prayer. Listen to the way this phrase in his prayer. Andrews is not our idol. Not like the posters of Michael Jordan and Michael Jackson and Madonna that grace the walls of dormitory rooms a stone's throw from this place. In other words, those are the idols of our kids going to college. If that's the case, we need to do some changing of who the idols of our kids are. But that didn't seem to be his burden to change that. He just mentioned that in his prayer in passing. I thought that was an amazing little part of his prayer. Kenneth Wood was the editor of the Adventist Review for many years. Kenneth Wood had a very, shall we say, dangerous proclivity of stating things too honestly. And boy, he got hit hard for it. But he was an editor for many years of the Adventist Review. And I would consider those the glory years of the Adventist Review. He retired in the early 1980s. The Review has never been the same since. But listen to what he said in 1980. That happened to be the years that I was at Pacific Union College. We are alarmed by the fact that some of our colleges seem to be drifting away from the standards and objectives established for them by their founders. We are alarmed by the secular climate that prevails on some campuses. We are alarmed by the strange winds of doctrine that blow on some campuses. He's now talking about our colleges. We are alarmed by the lax moral standards that prevail on some campuses. It is interesting to note that Mrs. White did not say, "Send your children to Battle Creek, God will preserve them from error and save them in His kingdom." No, she urged parents to keep their children away from the school in Battle Creek where false teachings were being circulated. Clearly, parents have an obligation to know what is being taught even at Adventist schools and to send their children only to those schools that teach historic Adventism and will strengthen the faith of the young people who are sent there. That is a volcanic editorial in the Adventist world, let me tell you. And did he get heat for that editorial from our Adventist educational leaders? But that was a remarkable editorial and right to the point of the reality. One last little thing on this. This was an article written by F.C. Gilbert, who was a Jew who became a Seventh-day Adventist, and he wrote an article, "Why Did the Jews Reject the Messiah?" Listen to his take on why they rejected Jesus. It was also suggested that by the Greeks that the Jews send their talented young man to Alexandria for training and instruction in the philosophies, sciences, and learning of the Greeks. Alexandria was the educational center of the world outside of Italy. It was in Egypt, and this was where a lot of philosophical discussion and training was taking place. And so they said, just bring your best scholars down to Alexandria so they'll understand better how to reach the Greek mind. The young men would gain knowledge, influence, prestige, and the more they advanced in learning, the higher would be their attainments. While the religious schools in Judea continued to operate, a marked declension in spiritual influence and power was visible. Year by year, the Word of God was studied less, as the courses of studies based on culture and philosophy increased. The curriculum of the rabbinical schools was influenced toward intellectualism. Since John and Jesus were not attendants at rabbinical schools, the people would not recognize their authority as teachers. Remember the statement, how knoweth this man letters, having never learned? They didn't mean he was ignorant. They meant he hadn't gone to the rabbinical schools. None who refused to accept the teaching of the rabbis were given recognition. When the Savior came to those who were custodians of the oracles of God, they failed to recognize him as the fulfillment of the types and prophecies in Moses and the prophets. In other words, they weren't studying the prophecies anymore. The leaders of Israel had to a great extent yielded to the demands of Greek culture and learning, thereby hoping to gain prestige and influence. So his answer to the question, why did the Jews reject the Messiah? Is that they were sent to outside universities to learn how to better reach the minds of the intellectuals of their day. They brought that back to the schools in Judea and turned the schools into the prophets, the schools of the prophets, into schools that Jesus and John could not attend, even though his mother tried to get him to attend those schools. And Jesus, in that one instance, disobeyed his own mother's counsel. He said, I can't go. And because of that, Elder Gilbert said, that was the basic reason that the Jews rejected the Messiah, is because he was so out of harmony with what they had been trained to expect and what their educational system was. What was the second major result of rejecting the 1888 message? Rejecting the message of education for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Sending Ellen White off. Then when it was attempted to be brought back into the center of Adventist work, sending Sutherland off. When that was established, ignoring them, going a different direction. And so, my friends, in Adventism, all of us, including myself, have grown up in an Adventist educational system which bears very little resemblance to what God told us to do to educate our children. And we wonder why 50% of our young people are walking away from the church. We wonder why we have to entertain them and have all sorts of drama and movies and all kinds of things to keep their interest alive. because they have lost the vision of what Adventism is all about. And that is not the fault of the schools alone. It is largely the fault of the homes from which those children come. And then they have no place to go. What is the remedy for this situation? Same as in medical missionary work. There are schools throughout the world that are attempting very hard to educate children the way God intended children to be educated. They are struggling too. They're self-supporting institutions just like Madison was. They don't get it all right, but they are trying hard to restore Adventist education to what God wanted it to be. They're scattered here and there around our country. I just went to one of those schools, how long ago? 2 months ago now, in Arkansas, where, believe it or not, we had young people, they have both an academy and a college there. We had young people from ages 14 through early 20s. And I do not bring my messages down to a 14-year-old level. The same messages you hear me give, I give to those young people. And they are sitting in their seats taking notes and listening. They are involved. They are wanting to learn. They are eager to understand God's will. And I don't have to bring my message down or turn cartwheels on the pulpit. I don't have to use PowerPoint. I don't use PowerPoint, as you know. And I don't have to use all the neat tricks of the trade. We simply study the Bible together. And this school is called Washita Hills Academy in southwestern Arkansas, an outstanding place to send children to be educated under the guidance of godly teachers according to the principles of the Spirit of prophecy. There are a few other institutions scattered here and there, and they are trying their very best. They have schools like this in Australia, in Europe. All around there are these schools, but you have to hunt for them. You don't find them by going to the Adventist directory of schools. You have to have somebody who knows. So what I'm simply saying is encourage that. No matter how old or young you are, encourage that. If you're talking to young people, if you're talking to parents, encourage that. And you can be a very strong help to what God intends to happen in these last days. Well, I have just selected those two areas, medical missionary work and educational work, as primary examples of what the 1888 rejection has cost the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We think of it just in righteousness by faith, but that's just the spiritual area that we have lost sight of. It is also very practical areas of our institutions that have lost their vision as to what we are, who we are, and what our intent is to be, all as a result of walking away from what God said was the beginning of the loud cry of the Adventist Church to the world. Well, we haven't seen any loud cry. That loud cry has been muted. It has been a silent cry virtually for the last 100 years, and it will never again be a loud cry until we do it God's way. We've got to get serious about doing it God's way. In our homes, in our churches, in our influence, and in our institutions. So I'm going to say that we have a job ahead of us to do if we want to see Jesus come in our lifetime. And that job is summarized in just one phrase: let's do it God's way. Let's just do it God's way. Let the chips fall where they may. Let's just do it God's way. In this church, let's do it God's way. In your home, let's do it God's way. Let's not quibble. Let's help our children and the ones we are responsible for, even our grandchildren, to have a better vision of doing it God's way. It's not just going to church. It's not just going to Sabbath school. It's doing it God's way. And why that's important. They are not just doing it to go to heaven. They are doing it to vindicate God's name and be one of those that God can use to put the final piece of the puzzle into place. We do individually have a job to do, and it's not an easy job. It is a job which runs against the grain, goes against the current, but it is necessary. 1888 has to become a reality in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, not just a history book. It has to become a reality, a living reality in righteousness by faith, in diet, in education, in medical missionary work. It has to become a reality in all those areas. And then we will see a latter rain and a loud cry, and Jesus will come. I want to be a part of that. I don't want to be sitting around waiting till I die, wondering if my grandchildren will get it right.